"Don't sit there," Black Waitress warned. The billionaire ignored her and regretted it. "What if I told you that one simple act of dismissing someone's kindness could change everything?" Richard Blackstone stepped into Mama Lou's diner on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, his $1,000 suit dripping wet and his patience wearing thin. The 42-year-old tech billionaire had just left another failed business meeting, and all he wanted was a quiet corner to make his calls. The diner buzzed with warmth and laughter, filled with working families sharing simple meals together. Keisha Johnson looked up from wiping down tables, her kind eyes immediately noticing the well-dressed stranger. At 35, she'd worked at Mama Lou's for 8 years, and she knew every regular customer's story, their struggles, their joys. She'd seen plenty of fancy folks come and go, but something about this man's cold demeanor made her heart ache. When she saw him heading toward the corner booth, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory about always looking out for others, even strangers. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Keisha wiped her hands on her apron and approached Richard carefully. The corner booth had been empty all evening for good reason. Old Joe Martinez usually sat there every Tuesday, sharing stories about his late wife while nursing a coffee that Keisha never charged him for. Joe had been coming to Mama Lou's since his retirement 15 years ago, finding solace in the diner's warmth after losing his beloved Maria. Tonight, he was running late because of the storm. "Excuse me, sir," Keisha said softly, her voice carrying the gentle southern accent she'd inherited from her grandmother. "I wouldn't sit there if I were you." Richard barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through stock prices that had dropped another 3 points. His company's latest app launch had flopped spectacularly, and investors were pulling out faster than he could count. The last thing he needed was some waitress telling him where he could or couldn't sit in a run-down diner that probably made less in a year than he spent on his morning coffee. "I'm fine here," he replied curtly, sliding into the worn leather seat. "Just bring me coffee, black." Keisha's heart sank, but she nodded respectfully. She'd learned long ago that some people needed to discover kindness the hard way. Her grandmother always said that life had a way of teaching lessons to those who refused to listen to gentle wisdom. She glanced toward the window, watching for Joe's familiar figure, walking slowly with his carved wooden cane. The diner's atmosphere felt different tonight. Regular customers exchanged the worried glances as they noticed the expensive stranger occupying Joe's sacred space. Maria Gonzalez, who ran the flower shop next door, shook her head sadly. The teenage busboy, Kevin, whispered to the cook about how wrong this felt. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that corner booth wasn't just a seat. It was Joe's lifeline to memories, his weekly ritual of healing. Richard remained oblivious to the growing tension. He barked orders at Keisha for a better Wi-Fi password, complained about the diner's outdated decor, and made loud phone calls about firing employees. His arrogance filled the small space like smoke, making other customers uncomfortable. Children stopped giggling, and elderly patrons lowered their voices out of respect for the building storm outside their windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, Keisha finally spotted Joe's hunched figure shuffling across the parking lot, his umbrella turned inside out by the wind. Her stomach twisted with worry. Joe had been fragile lately, and she knew how much their Tuesday evening conversations meant to him. He'd often tell her that sitting in that booth, looking out at the street where he'd first met Maria 50 years ago, was the closest thing to peace he'd found since her passing. Richard continued his calls, completely unaware that he was about to encounter someone whose quiet dignity would challenge everything he thought he understood about respect, loss, and the value of simple human kindness. The storm outside was nothing compared to the emotional reckoning that was about to unfold inside Mama Lou's diner, where an elderly man's weekly pilgrimage would teach a billionaire the true meaning of wealth. The bell above the door chimed softly as Joe Martinez pushed inside, shaking rainwater from his worn jacket. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he folded his umbrella, and his grey eyes immediately sought out his usual corner booth. For 8 years since Maria's funeral, that spot had been his sanctuary, his place to remember her laugh and the way she used to point out young couples walking hand in hand past the window. Joe's face fell when he saw the stranger in his booth, speaking loudly into his phone about stock portfolios and layoffs. The elderly man stood there for a moment, water dripping from his coat, uncertainty clouding his gentle features. He'd never asked anyone to move before. This was just a diner after all, not his personal property. But that booth held 8 years of whispered conversations with his late wife's memory. Keisha rushed over, her heart breaking at the confusion in Joe's eyes. "Mr. Martinez, let me get you settled at table 6 tonight." "No, thank you, dear," Joe said quietly, his voice barely audible above Richard's aggressive phone conversation. "I think I'll just head home tonight." "Please don't leave," Keisha whispered, gently touching Joe's arm. She approached Richard's booth again, this time with more determination. "Sir, I hate to bother you, but that gentleman who just came in has been sitting in this exact booth every Tuesday evening for 8 years. Since his wife passed away, this has become very important to him. Would you mind terribly if we moved you to another table?" Richard looked up from his phone call with annoyance. "Look, I got here first. I'm not moving for some old man who thinks he owns a public restaurant." The diner fell silent. Even the sizzling from the grill seemed to quiet, as other customers absorbed the coldness of Richard's response. Joe heard every word, and his shoulders sagged, as if the weight of loneliness had suddenly doubled. He turned toward the door, moving slowly like a man carrying invisible burdens. Keisha felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Joe's retreat. She'd seen him cry only once before, on the anniversary of Maria's death, when he'd shown her their wedding photo and talked about how they used to dream of traveling together in retirement. Now, she was watching his weekly dose of comfort slip away because of one man's selfishness. "Mr. Martinez, wait," she called out, but Joe was already pushing through the door, back into the storm. The other customers began murmuring among themselves, their disappointment palpable. Mrs. Chen, who owned the laundromat next door, shook her head sadly. The young couple at table 3 held hands tighter, as if witnessing such casual cruelty reminded them to cherish their tenderness. Even the teenage busboy looked upset, understanding instinctively that something precious had just been damaged. Richard returned to his phone call, completely unmoved by the scene he'd caused. He had no idea that his refusal to show basic courtesy had just broken a grieving widower's heart, or that karma was already setting wheels in motion. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness matter more than we realize. 20 minutes passed before Richard noticed the change in atmosphere. Conversations had grown quieter, and several customers had left earlier than usual. The cheerful energy that had filled Mama Lou's when he arrived had been replaced by something heavier, more somber. Even Keisha seemed different as she refilled his coffee, her usual warm smile replaced by professional politeness. Richard asked, finally looking up from his laptop screen. Keisha paused, setting down the coffee pot with deliberate care. "Actually, sir, you might say that. You just broke the heart of the kindest man I know. Joe Martinez comes here every Tuesday to remember his late wife. They used to walk past this window every evening for 40 years. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm sorry for his loss, but I can't be expected to know everyone's personal story. You're right, Keisha said softly. You couldn't have known. But when I tried to explain, you had a choice. You could have shown kindness to a grieving elderly man, or you could have insisted on your rights. For the first time that evening, Richard felt a flicker of something uncomfortable in his chest. He glanced around the diner, noticing how other customers were looking at him with undisguised disapproval. A little girl at a nearby table asked her mother why the sad man had to leave, and the mother whispered something about how important it was to be kind to people who were hurting. Richard's phone buzzed with another crisis at work, but he found himself distracted. He kept thinking about the old man's face when he'd turned to leave. There had been something deeply familiar about that expression of defeat. It reminded him of his own grandfather, who'd spent his final years alone after Richard's family had become too busy with success to visit. Richard found himself asking when Keisha returned with his check. Keisha's expression softened. Maria was beautiful inside and out. They met right here, actually, when this place was called Tony's Cafe 50 years ago. Joe was a young construction worker, and Maria was a teacher. He used to joke that she taught him more than just love. She taught him how to see goodness in everyone. After she passed from cancer, Joe started coming here to talk to her memory. Richard felt something crack open in his chest. His grandfather had done the same thing after his grandmother died, talking to her photograph, until the day he died alone in a nursing home. Richard had been too busy building his empire to visit much during those final months. They would have been married 52 years next month, Keisha continued. The weight of understanding settled on Richard's shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd dismissed someone's grief as inconsequential, just like his family had dismissed his grandfather's loneliness. Have you ever realized too late that your actions hurt someone deeply? Let us know in the comments how you learned to choose kindness over being right. Richard stared at his laptop screen, but the numbers blurred as memories of his grandfather flooded back. Harold Blackstone had built a small but successful carpentry business, teaching young Richard about integrity and treating people with respect. Richard had forgotten those lessons somewhere between his first million and his first billion. Success had insulated him from others' pain, making him believe that being first in line meant he deserved special treatment. Tonight, he'd treated a grieving widower like an inconvenience, exactly the way busy family members had treated his grandfather's loneliness. Richard asked suddenly, looking up at Keisha, "Joe?" "About 6 blocks from here." Richard closed his laptop and stood up, leaving a $100 bill on the table. The rain had intensified as Richard drove his luxury sedan slowly through the modest neighborhood, windshield wipers struggling against the storm. He found Joe's small house easily. It was the only one with lights still on and a figure sitting alone on the covered porch, despite the weather. Richard parked and walked through the rain, his expensive shoes squelching in puddles. Joe looked up in surprise as the well-dressed stranger approached his porch steps. He asked cautiously, "Mr. Martinez, my name is Richard Blackstone." Richard felt rain dripping from his hair, his pride soaking away with his expensive suit. Joe studied him for a long moment. Richard climbed the porch steps, noting the worn but well-maintained furniture, the small garden that even in winter showed signs of careful tending. "I lost my grandfather 3 years ago. He spent his final years alone because his family was too busy to visit. Tonight, I became the kind of person who dismisses someone else's pain as unimportant." Joe gestured to the empty chair beside him. Sit down, son. As Richard sat, Joe pointed to the front yard where a small oak tree stood. Maria and I planted that tree on our first anniversary. Every year, it gets a little bigger, a little stronger. The waitress, Keisha, told me about your Tuesday visits to the diner. 40 years of evening walks, Joe nodded. After she died, those Tuesday nights became my way of keeping our routine alive. Richard felt tears he hadn't cried since his grandfather's funeral. It's not silly. It's beautiful. You didn't destroy anything, Joe said gently. You just forgot, temporarily, how to see other people's hearts. If you've been enjoying this story of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that remind us of our shared humanity. I want to make this right, Richard said, sitting forward in his chair. Joe smiled, the first real smile Richard had seen from him all evening. You already have, son. It takes courage to drive through a storm, to apologize to a stranger. Richard spent the next hour on Joe's porch, listening to stories about Maria's kindness, their simple but rich life together, and the small traditions that had kept their love alive for 5 decades. Joe showed him Maria's garden journal, where she'd sketched plans for flowers that would bloom in sequence through the seasons. He talked about their dreams of travel, cut short by her illness, and how the diner visits helped him feel connected to their shared memories. Joe asked as the rain began to soften. She said that kindness is the only thing we can give away that somehow makes us richer. Richard felt something shift inside his chest, like ice melting after a long winter. Would you let me drive you to the diner next Tuesday? I'd like that, Joe nodded. Remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to choose someone else's heart over your own convenience. The following Tuesday, Richard arrived at Mama Lou's 30 minutes early and specifically requested that Joe's corner booth remain empty. When Joe walked in, Keisha's face lit up with genuine joy as she watched Richard stand and warmly greet his new friend. The two men sat together, Joe sharing memories while Richard listened with the attention he'd never given his own grandfather. Over the following months, Tuesday dinners became a tradition. Richard learned about Maria's work with literacy programs, about Joe's pride in building the local community center, about a generation that understood wealth in terms of relationships rather than bank accounts. In return, Richard shared stories about his grandfather's carpentry wisdom and began volunteering his business expertise to help local small businesses. On what would have been Joe and Maria's 52nd anniversary, Richard surprised Joe with something special. A small memorial garden next to the diner, with a bench facing the window where they used to walk. Joe wept tears of gratitude, but they were healing tears, not lonely ones. That evening, as they sat in their usual booth, Joe pulled out a faded photograph of him and Maria on their wedding day. She always said that everyone we meet is carrying either love or pain, and our job is to respond with kindness either way. Richard understood then that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments like these, when strangers become family and broken hearts learn to heal together. If you enjoyed this story about second chances and the power of human connection, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Thank you for joining us on this journey of redemption, and reminder that it's never too late to choose kindness over convenience.